Ross Callahan had survived a lot of things in her 28 years. She had survived a drought that turned her crops to dust. She had survived the fever that took her husband Daniel in the winter of 1878. She had survived the long, hollow months that followed, the silence of a house that used to hold laughter, the weight of grief that pressed down on her chest every morning like a stone. But standing outside the dog trader's post on the main street of Redrock Hollow, holding a frayed rope attached to the most faithful creature she had ever known, Ross wasn't sure she could survive this. Biscuit sat beside her left boot the way he always did, alert, trusting. His amber eyes moved up to her face with that particular attention that dogs reserve only for the people they have decided, completely and without condition, to love. He was scruffy, a cattle-dog mix with one torn ear and a patch of white fur on his chest shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. Daniel had found him as a pup, half-starved behind a feed barn, and carried him home inside his jacket. That was 6 years ago. Biscuit had outlasted the drought, the fever, and the debt collectors. He was the last living thing that still connected Ross to the life she used to have. She had arrived in Redrock Hollow 3 days ago with 14 cents, a carpet bag, and Biscuit on a rope. The town sat along a red clay road in the Colorado Territory, a cluster of sun-beaten buildings, a water trough, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, and people who had long since learned not to ask too many questions about where a person came from. Ross had asked around quietly for work. The boarding house needed no help. The general store already had a boy sweeping and stacking. The saloon's owner, a thick-armed woman named Dora, had looked Ross up and down and said, with no particular cruelty, "I don't hire women who look like they're still in mourning, honey. Bad for the atmosphere." That left Hector Grimes, who owned half the buildings on the east side of town and rented the other half at rates that made grown men wince. He had a barn behind his livery stable dry with clean straw, and he offered it to Ross for 1 week free as what he called frontier charity, though his eyes suggested he expected gratitude in abundance. "One condition," he said, scratching beneath his hat. "No animals in the barn. I run a clean operation." "He's a working dog," Ross said. "He doesn't cause trouble." "Neither do I," Grimes replied, "until someone pushes me. No dog, those are the terms." She had stood there on the street holding Biscuit's rope for a long time after Grimes walked away, doing the arithmetic of desperation. 1 week of shelter gave her time to find proper work. Proper work meant wages. Wages meant a room, food, and eventually a plan. But only if she took the barn, and the barn had one condition. The dog trader's post was 3 buildings down. A hand-painted sign read, "Working DOGS bought and sold. Fair PRICES." Ross walked slowly. Biscuit trotted at her heel the way he had been trained, glancing up every few steps the way he always did, checking on her, because that was his nature, to check on her, to stay close, to make sure she was still there. She tied his rope to the post outside the trader's door. Her fingers moved carefully, the way you do something when you're trying not to feel it. She crouched down to his level. Biscuit licked her cheek once, then sat still, reading her face with those amber eyes. "You'll go to a ranch," she whispered. "You'll have work to do. You'll be good at it." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. She stood up before she could change her mind and walked away without looking back. She made it exactly 11 steps. Behind her, Biscuit began to howl, long, broken, and inconsolable, and the sound stopped every person on that street cold, including a tall, quiet cowboy leaning against the post office wall, who had been watching the whole thing without a word. The cowboy didn't call out to her. He didn't rush. He simply untied Biscuit's rope from the post with one unhurried motion, the way a man moves when he has already made up his mind, and walked after her with the dog trotting willingly at his side, as though Biscuit had known him for years rather than seconds. Ross heard the footsteps behind her and turned sharp. Her eyes dropped to Biscuit first, then rose to the man holding the rope. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a sun-darkened face and the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. He wore a plain brown duster, worn boots, and a hat with a dent in the crown that suggested it had lived a long and practical life. He held Biscuit's rope out toward her without a word. "What do you think you're doing?" Ross said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Returning your dog," Joey Calloway said simply. "I left him there on purpose." "I know." He didn't elaborate. He just kept holding out the rope, patient as a fence post, until the silence grew uncomfortable enough that she took it. Biscuit immediately pressed against her leg and sat on her boot. Ross looked down at him, then back up at the cowboy, her jaw tight with the particular pride of someone who refuses to be pitied. "If you're expecting thanks," she said, "I'd save the wait." "I'm not." Joey tilted his head slightly toward the edge of town, where the road curved west past a row of cottonwood trees. "I own the Calloway Ranch, about 2 miles out that road. I need someone steady to help manage the house, keep records, and work the yard when we're short-handed. Wages are fair, $7 a month, meals included, private room in the east wing of the house." He paused. "Dog comes too." Ross studied him the way frontier women learn to study strangers, carefully, looking for the angle, the thing underneath the offer that would cost her more than she could afford. Men in the West didn't hand things to women without expecting something in return. That was not cynicism. That was experience. "Why?" she asked. "Because I watched you walk away from that post," Joey said, "and I could tell you weren't somebody who gives things up easily. That's exactly the kind of person I need on a working ranch." It wasn't the smoothest answer. It wasn't charming or rehearsed. That was precisely why she believed it enough to say yes. Provisionally, with 3 conditions, she stated plainly on the street. She would take no orders that weren't related to the work. She would have a lock on her door. And if the arrangement wasn't agreeable after 2 weeks, she would leave without argument and without debt. Joey agreed to all 3 without hesitation. The ranch was exactly what he'd described, working and weather-worn, but solid. Ross threw herself into it with the focused energy of someone who needed not to think too hard about everything she had lost. Within 4 days, the house ledgers were organized for the first time in what appeared to be years. Within 6, Biscuit had done something remarkable. During a routine move of Joey's small cattle herd across the lower pasture, Biscuit had simply begun to work, cutting, circling, responding to the cattle's movement with an instinct so clean and precise that 2 of Joey's ranch hands stopped and stared. Joey watched from the fence rail without a word, but Ross caught the look on his face. It wasn't just approval. It was the expression of a man witnessing something that quietly solves a problem he'd carried for a long time. The ranch ran better. The atmosphere shifted. For the first time in recent memory, Ross went 2 full days without the stone weight feeling in her chest. Then she found the poster. It was tucked inside the back cover of an old land record book she was reorganizing on the study shelf, folded twice, the paper age-yellowed and soft at the creases. She opened it out of instinct, the way you unfold anything whose edges are hidden. The face staring back at her was younger, sharper, without the weathered lines, but the eyes were unmistakable. Wanted Joey Calloway, theft of railroad land, 1871. Ross stood very still in the quiet study, the paper in her hands, Biscuit asleep at her feet, and the sound of Joey's boots crossing the yard outside moving steadily toward the front door. Ross folded the poster exactly as she had found it and placed it back inside the land record book. She set the book on the shelf. Then she sat down in the study chair and waited, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to breathe when something required her to think before she acted. Joey came through the front door, pulled off his hat, and found her sitting there in the study's dim light. He looked at her face and stopped walking. Men who have spent years watching for danger develop, a particular sensitivity to the quality of silence in a room. Joey read hers in under a second. "You found it," he said. "Tell me the truth," Ross replied. "All of it, right now." He sat down across from her without argument. He turned his hat slowly in his hands the way men do when they're reaching back for something painful, and he told her everything. In 1871, his family had owned 400 acres of grazing land west of the territory line, land his father had settled, fenced, and worked for 19 years. The Continental Railroad expansion needed that corridor. When the Calloway family refused to sell, railroad lawyers arrived with documents that had been quietly, expertly forged. The land was seized legally on paper and fraudulently in every way that actually mattered. His father died the following winter, not from illness, Joey said, but from the particular kind of defeat that breaks something structural inside a man. Joey had taken back what he could, a portion of the deed records. Enough to embarrass the railroad, not enough to beat them in court. They called it theft. He called it survival. Ross listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally. "You don't have to. I know." She reached into the collar of her dress and pulled at a seam she had stitched herself, somewhere between Redrock Hollow and the life before it. From inside the lining of her coat, folded into a strip of oilcloth, she withdrew a set of documents, worn, carefully preserved, and damning. Daniel's original land grant, the forged transfer notice, a signed affidavit from a neighboring homesteader who had witnessed the same railroad agents operating in their county 2 years before the Calloway seizure. She laid them on the desk between her and Joey. "They came for us too," she said quietly. "Different company, same method." Daniel tried to fight it through letters. "It didn't work. I kept everything he gathered because I didn't know what else to keep." Joey looked at the documents for a long time. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted, not broken, but opened. They didn't have time to say anything more. Biscuit was on his feet. The dog moved to the window in 3 sharp steps, low and bristling, a sound building in his chest that Ross had never heard from him before, not a bark but a sustained, urgent warning that vibrated through the floorboards. Joey was at the window in seconds. Riding up through the eastern gully, still a quarter-mile out but moving with the focused direction of a man who knew exactly where he was going, was a rider in a gray coat. Sloan, the railroad's man. Joey had known for months that he was getting closer. Biscuit had tracked his approach through the gully scrub long before any human ear could have caught it. They had 10 minutes, maybe 12. It was enough. Joey rode to fetch the territory judge, a man named Arlen Booth, who was 2 days into a stop at Redrock Hollow's only hotel, the kind of fortunate timing that history occasionally offers to people who have waited long enough for it. Ross met Sloan at the ranch gate herself, calm and straight-backed, and informed him that the property was currently under legal review by territorial authority. Sloan was the kind of man who understood when the ground had shifted beneath him. He waited, because the alternative was worse. Judge Booth reviewed the combined documents that evening by lamplight in the ranch study. He asked precise questions. Ross and Joey answered them. By the following morning, Booth had issued a formal findings notice. The land seizure pattern was fraudulent. The warrant against Joey Calloway was voided, and Sloan was taken into custody by the territorial marshal on charges of criminal harassment and conspiracy on behalf of an unlicensed land agent. The railroad company's reach, it turned out, was slightly shorter than they had believed. 3 days later, Redrock Hollow had mostly moved on to other conversations, the way small towns do. The ranch was quiet in the good way, the way that means things are working as they should. Biscuit was asleep in a patch of late afternoon sun on the porch, one ear twitching, satisfied with himself in the uncomplicated way that dogs are satisfied when they have done their job well. Joey found Ross at the porch rail, looking out across the pasture where the cattle moved slowly through the golden grass. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not as hired help, as a partner, equal share of whatever this ranch becomes." Ross considered the pasture, the sky, the dog asleep behind her. She thought about every door that had been closed to her in this town, and the one man who had simply walked up and handed her back what she had tried to give away. "Yes," she said. It was a small word for a large answer. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the light turned amber across the whole valley, warm and unhurried, the kind that makes everything look like it was always meant to be exactly this way. Ross leaned against the porch rail. Joey stood beside her. Biscuit stretched in his sleep, rolled slightly and settled again. All three of them were home.